If pride keeps you away from those you love, listen to this story. In a quiet and verdant forest, tucked away from the human world, lived Old Joe, an elderly dog known throughout the woodland for his gentle heart and enduring wisdom. With his coat streaked silver by age and his eyes bright with countless stories, Joe had become a beloved figure among the creatures of the forest. The birds and squirrels often came to him, sharing tales of their adventures or seeking guidance on troubles that seemed immense to their small lives. Even the young foxes and rabbits knew that Old Joe, patient and understanding, was never too busy to lend an ear or offer a word of advice. Old Joe's home was a cozy hollow beneath a towering old oak, its roots winding around his den like protective arms. From here, he would watch the seasons change, the leaves turning from green to gold, and then falling like gentle rain to the forest floor. Each season brought new sounds and colors, and Joe cherished them all, understanding the beauty in their inevitable passing. His life had become one of quiet reflection, watching over his beloved home and its inhabitants, finding joy in their company and in the harmony of the forest itself. For years, this corner of the forest had known peace. The animals had formed a close-knit community where trust and kindness bound them together, and Old Joe, with his steady, unassuming presence, was like an elder to all. He had weathered storms and sheltered the young during harsh winters. It was as if his quiet strength held the forest together in ways the animals didn't even realize. But one day, a rumor began to spread among the forest animals that a new creature had arrived at the forest's edge, one unlike any they had known before. Whispers of a powerful and proud wolf made their way from the deer to the foxes and all the way to the birds, who carried the news on swift wings. The wolf, it was said, was fierce, solitary, and unwilling to mingle with any of the creatures who dared to approach. Curious about this newcomer, Old Joe listened to the stories with a calm curiosity. But unlike the other animals, he did not immediately judge or fear the stranger. "Everyone has their own story," he would say when asked, "and some just take longer to find where they belong." While the other animals hesitated, uncertain of this newcomer's intentions, Old Joe held on to his faith in the forest's balance, trusting that, given time, even the most hardened souls could find a place of peace. News of the wolf's arrival continued to stir the animals. Over time, details began to trickle in about this lone wolf named Coda, whose pride seemed as vast as the wilderness itself. Unlike the other animals, who often sought companionship for warmth and safety, Coda kept entirely to himself. He was large, with fur dark as midnight, and he moved through the forest with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. His piercing yellow eyes missed nothing, but his gaze seemed to dismiss everything. Any attempt from other animals to approach him was met with an air of indifference, if not disdain. Coda had chosen a shadowy part of the forest as his territory, an area near a rocky hill where few creatures dared to go. Here, he patrolled his boundaries, marking them with his scent, warning others to stay away. He saw no need for friendships or alliances. To him, companionship was nothing more than a distraction from survival, something he'd managed alone his entire life. His pride had taught him to be wary of attachment, viewing it as a weakness that would only slow him down. And so, Coda kept his distance, watching the other animals with quiet contempt, amused by what he saw as their reliance on each other. Old Joe, meanwhile, continued to hear stories of Coda's aloofness. The younger animals, in particular, found Coda's solitary nature intimidating. Many would give his territory a wide berth, fearful of disturbing him. Even the birds flew silently over his domain, sensing his powerful presence below. Despite this, Old Joe couldn't shake a feeling of concern that settled in his heart whenever he heard Coda's name. He had seen many animals come and go, each with their own burdens and reasons, but he sensed that Coda's pride was a wall that kept him from something essential, perhaps even something healing. One chilly autumn evening, Old Joe sat by the edge of the forest, watching as the day slipped into dusk. The golden light filtered through the leaves, casting shadows that danced and faded with the breeze. He felt a certain heaviness in the air, a sense that Koda's presence brought not just strength, but also a tension that lingered among the animals. "Pride can be a lonely companion," Joe murmured to himself, observing the beauty of the forest as the sun began to set. It troubled him that Koda might miss these shared moments, the warmth of a community that knew his name and welcomed his presence. Joe knew well enough that no creature was meant to walk alone forever. He hoped that Koda, in time, might see this for himself. As darkness fell, old Joe retreated to his den, but the thought of the proud wolf lingered in his mind. There was something about Koda's solitude, about his defiant distance from the other creatures, that troubled old Joe in a way he couldn't quite explain. Still, he remained patient, trusting in the forest's way of teaching each creature the lessons they needed most. As the weeks passed, Koda's pride and disdain for the other creatures became a wall too high for any of the animals to scale. He watched them from a distance, dismissing their chatter and companionship as weakness. The few times animals had dared to approach him, he made it clear they were unwelcome. The deer were too soft, the foxes too sly, and the rabbits he thought too small and jittery to be of any interest. Koda was certain he needed no one, and he clung to this certainty with fierce determination. Then, one fateful afternoon, Koda's isolation would face its first true test. As he wandered the forest in search of prey, a sudden shift of shadows caught his eye. A group of hunters had entered the forest. Silent and swift, they moved with nets and snares, their scent unfamiliar and alarming. Koda immediately slipped deeper into the trees, but as he evaded them, he became reckless, not noticing the root tangled underfoot. One swift movement and his paw twisted painfully, sending him crashing to the ground. The sharp, biting pain spread through his leg, making it nearly impossible to stand. Koda bit back a growl, furious with himself for the accident, but his frustration gave way to dread. Alone and wounded, he realized the hunters would not be far behind. His instincts screamed at him to run, yet his injured leg held him back, throbbing with every attempt to rise. He scanned the shadows, weighing his options, but even his pride could not hide the fact that he was vulnerable and in grave danger. With the hunters nearing, Koda struggled to pull himself forward, his pride urging him to push through the pain and escape. But his injury slowed him, each step faltering under the weight of his body. Alone in the heart of the forest, the once proud wolf felt a pang of desperation. He understood for the first time that his solitary strength had its limits, yet he could not bear the thought of calling for help. That, to him, was unthinkable. As the sounds of footsteps grew louder, Koda's pride warred with his instinct to survive. It was then that he thought of old Joe, the dog he had often seen wandering the forest with a calm, knowing gaze. Koda remembered hearing stories of Joe's kindness, his willingness to help any creature in need. But the idea of relying on another was unbearable. The proud wolf shook his head, clinging to his independence even in his weakened state. "I don't need anyone," he whispered to himself, a glint of defiance in his eyes. Yet as he lay in the shadows, breathing heavily and trying to quell the pain, Koda knew in his heart that his pride had led him into a place even his strength couldn't escape alone. Nightfall was approaching, and with it, the hunters would return, unyielding in their search. And so, Koda lay there, torn between his pride and the growing fear gnawing at his heart. For the first time, he was forced to confront the truth that even the strongest sometimes need the hands they had once pushed away. As the night crept over the forest, a deep chill settled in, and Koda's pain only grew sharper. Each movement sent a stabbing ache through his leg, and his attempts to crawl away had left him exhausted and bruised. Still, his pride kept him silent, unwilling to make a sound that might reveal his vulnerability. He lay under the thick shadows, his dark coat blending into the forest floor, yet the loneliness he had so fiercely guarded now wrapped around him like a weight he could no longer bear. The distant howl of another wolf echoed through the trees, a sound of strength and kinship that stirred something deep within him, a longing he didn't dare acknowledge. For a moment, Koda closed his eyes, fighting the instinct to answer back, knowing he was too weak to join them even if he tried. The silence returned, enveloping him in a darkness that felt heavier with each passing second. And then, a familiar scent drifted through the air, one that Koda recognized with a hint of irritation, but also with a growing sense of hope. It was old Joe. Somewhere, not far away, the old dog was wandering, probably unaware of Koda's desperate situation. A quiet growl rose in Koda's throat, his pride flaring up once more. But the throbbing pain in his leg reminded him of his limitations, forcing him to confront the grim reality he had avoided all his life. He could not escape this alone. As if sensing his presence, old Joe moved closer, his steps slow and steady. Koda could hear the soft crunch of leaves under his paws, the unhurried gait of a creature who had long made peace with the world. The proud wolf felt torn, his heart pounding with the instinct to drive Joe away, to hide his weakness. But beneath his pride, a flicker of humility began to rise, small yet undeniable. Finally, unable to resist, Koda let out a low, reluctant whine, the sound barely louder than a whisper. It was enough. Old Joe's ears perked up, his head tilting as he listened carefully. With practiced calm, he approached the spot where Koda lay hidden, his eyes soft with understanding as he spotted the injured wolf. Without hesitation or judgment, Joe moved closer, his presence radiating a quiet strength that made Koda feel both ashamed and grateful. "You look like you could use a hand," Joe murmured, his tone gentle and kind, with no hint of pity. Koda stiffened, his pride instinctively pushing him to snap back. But the warmth in Joe's voice softened his defenses, and for the first time in his life, Koda lowered his gaze, nodding with the smallest hint of surrender. Joe lay down beside him, his warmth easing the cold that had settled into Koda's bones. As they sat in silence, Koda felt a strange, humbling peace take hold of him. He realized that despite his earlier arrogance, it was not weakness to lean on another. Joe, who had heard the stories of Koda's pride and coldness, did not hold it against him. Instead, he simply sat with him through the night, offering his quiet strength as a balm to Koda's pain. In that silence, Koda felt his heart crack open, the weight of his pride lifting just enough to let in the comfort he had pushed away for so long. As dawn broke over the forest, a soft light filtered through the trees, casting a gentle glow around old Joe and Koda. The wolf had barely slept, his mind wrestling with emotions he had long suppressed. Yet in Joe's quiet company, Koda found a comfort he hadn't realized he needed. Joe had stayed beside him through the night, keeping watch and listening to the forest's murmurs, his presence steady and unassuming. This silent companionship stirred something unfamiliar in Koda, a sense of trust that slowly chipped away at his fierce independence. When the first rays of sunlight touched his face, Koda stirred, wincing as his injured leg reminded him of the events from the previous day. Despite his pride, he felt a pang of gratitude toward the old dog beside him, who had neither mocked nor belittled him. Instead, Joe had offered his presence as naturally as the trees provided shade. Koda felt his walls begin to crumble, just a little, allowing him to glimpse a life where connection wasn't a burden, but a strength. Seeing that Koda was awake, old Joe looked at him with a warm, encouraging smile. "You don't have to face every challenge alone, you know," he said, his tone gentle yet filled with wisdom. "Even the strongest creatures have their moments of weakness. Sometimes it's the trust we place in others that brings out our true strength." Koda looked away, conflicted. The idea of relying on others went against everything he had believed. every instinct he had honed over his solitary life. But Joe's words lingered, their simplicity cutting through his pride. He glanced at the old dog, noting the quiet strength that Joe carried, a strength that did not need to boast or prove itself. Somehow, that strength felt more resilient than the kind Koda had always tried to embody. It was a new perspective, one that felt both unsettling and oddly freeing. After a long pause, Koda spoke, his voice soft but sincere. "I always thought that leaning on someone else would make me weak," he admitted, his gaze falling to the ground. "But last night I was afraid. I didn't know if I would make it through. And now," he hesitated, but the words once hidden behind his pride began to flow. "Now I see there's a different kind of strength, one I didn't understand before." Joe listened without interruption, his face calm and understanding. "Strength isn't just in fighting alone, Koda. It's also in knowing when to accept help and when to give it. Life in the forest has taught me that we're all connected, even when we don't realize it." For the first time, Koda felt his heart soften. He had spent so much of his life guarding his pride that he had missed the power that came from unity and connection. The idea that he could still be strong while accepting others' support was a revelation, like a light slowly breaking through the shadows. Before long, other animals began to approach cautiously, curious about the sight of old Joe and the usually solitary wolf together. They brought herbs and leaves for Koda's injury, small offerings that showed their willingness to help, despite Koda's earlier coldness. He watched them with quiet wonder, marveling at the simple generosity they showed him, even though he had done nothing to deserve it. As they helped him, Koda felt something shift within him, a new humility and perhaps, for the first time, a sense of belonging. In that moment, surrounded by creatures he once dismissed as weak, Koda understood the true strength of community. His heart felt lighter, unburdened by the pride he had clung to for so long, and he silently vowed to let this newfound connection guide him. With each passing day, Koda's understanding of the forest and its creatures deepened. His leg, though still sore, was healing, thanks to the herbs and care from the animals he had once disregarded. Every morning, as old Joe checked on him, they shared stories and reflected on the life around them. Joe's words held wisdom that seemed to unlock parts of Koda's heart he hadn't known existed. The old dog's friendship was gentle and unassuming, never demanding but always present, and Koda found himself looking forward to their conversations. One day, while they rested together under the shade of a tree, Joe turned to Koda with a thoughtful expression. "Tell me, Koda, what drives you to keep yourself so separate from the others?" he asked. There was no accusation in his voice, only genuine curiosity. Koda hesitated, his gaze turning inward as he searched for an answer. It was a question he'd never really examined before. "I guess it's because I thought I didn't need anyone," Koda replied slowly, his tone heavy with reflection. "My pride kept me going through hard times. It's what made me strong when I was alone." He paused, his eyes softened by a realization that felt both painful and liberating. "But maybe I was wrong. I see now that there's a strength in connection I never understood before." Joe nodded knowingly. "Strength can take many forms, Koda. Sometimes it's the courage to trust others that makes us truly strong. The forest teaches us that. Alone, we survive, but together, we thrive." Koda let Joe's words sink in, feeling a newfound sense of purpose stirring within him. His pride, which had once kept him at a distance, was loosening its grip, allowing something gentler and more meaningful to take its place. The forest, once a mere hunting ground to him, was beginning to feel like a home, a place where he could share his strengths and, when needed, rely on others' support. Determined to give back, Koda started patrolling the forest in the evenings, using his sharp senses to help protect the creatures who had come to his aid. He warned them of danger, helped the young find shelter, and guarded the smaller animals during storms. Word of his change spread quickly, and the animals began to trust him in a way he'd never experienced before. In one of these patrols, Koda noticed a young rabbit trapped in a snare set by humans. Without hesitation, he sprang into action, his once proud independence now guided by a sense of duty toward the forest's other creatures. Carefully, he loosened the snare, freeing the trembling rabbit who looked up at him with wide, grateful eyes. "Thank you, Koda," the rabbit whispered, her small voice filled with wonder. "I didn't think anyone would come." The words touched something deep within Koda, a part of him that was only now beginning to blossom. For the first time in his life, he felt a sense of belonging that wasn't about dominance or pride, but about the simple joy of being part of something larger than himself. He returned to Old Joe that evening, his heart filled with gratitude, and found the old dog waiting for him, a quiet smile on his face. "You've come a long way, Koda," Joe said warmly, recognizing the transformation in the once proud wolf. Koda lowered his head in acknowledgement, feeling a humility that came not from weakness, but from a newfound strength rooted in connection and purpose. As they sat side by side, the forest seemed to wrap around them like an old friend, embracing Koda's growth with silent approval. He had found his place, not as a lone wolf driven by pride, but as a valued part of the forest community. It was a role he hadn't known he needed, but now it felt like he had finally come home. As time went on, Koda became a respected protector of the forest. The animals, once wary of him, now saw him as a friend and ally. They no longer kept their distance. Instead, they greeted him warmly and trusted him to look after their shared home. The wolf, who had once guarded his pride above all else, now guarded the well-being of those around him, finding purpose in the unity that once seemed foreign. One day, as Koda and Old Joe walked through the forest together, a gentle breeze rustled the leaves above them, casting dappled sunlight across their path. The quiet companionship they shared had become a cherished part of Koda's life, a reminder of the power in connection. As they walked, Koda turned to Joe, his eyes filled with gratitude. "I never would have understood any of this without you," he admitted, his voice softened by the humility that had taken root within him. Old Joe looked at him with a knowing smile. "The wisdom was always there, Koda. Sometimes it just takes a friend to help us see what's been inside us all along." Koda nodded, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He realized that he was no longer driven by the desire to stand apart, to be the strongest, or to command respect through pride. Now, he was motivated by something deeper, a sense of belonging that had reshaped his heart and his understanding of strength. His pride, once a barrier, had been transformed into a quiet confidence that didn't need to prove itself. The forest, too, seemed to recognize the change in Koda. Animals who once avoided him now came to him with trust in their eyes, and Koda, in turn, greeted each creature with warmth and patience, offering the same kindness he had once received from Old Joe. He found himself watching over the younger animals with a protective care he hadn't known he was capable of, teaching them the lessons he had learned from Joe about the value of community and connection. One evening, as the sun set over the forest, Koda stood with Old Joe at the edge of a quiet glade. He looked out at the animals gathering nearby, some playing, others resting, all sharing in the peace that the forest offered. Koda felt a wave of contentment wash over him, and he turned to Joe, his old friend, with a look of deep respect. "You taught me that real strength isn't in standing alone," Koda said, his voice thick with emotion, "but in standing together, in lifting each other up." He paused, then continued, "Thank you, Joe, for showing me the way." Joe simply nodded, his eyes shining with pride for the wolf he had come to see as more than just a friend, a partner in protecting the forest and its creatures. As they stood together, watching the life of the forest pulse and breathe around them, Koda understood that he had found something far greater than the solitary strength he once worshipped. He had found a place, a family, and a purpose rooted in love and respect, and he knew he would never again walk alone. And so, Koda's story became a legend in the forest, a tale of how a proud heart was softened by humility, a reminder that even the strongest among us need the bonds that tie us to others. The animals would share his story with newcomers, passing down the lesson that pride may build walls, but true strength builds bridges. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe and share it with those you love. Remember, pride can separate us from those who care about us, but humility brings us closer, making us stronger together.